Erev Tov, everybody. Welcome on behalf of our wonderful series, Torah Motion, the traditional response to Reform Judaism. This is today class number 5 already, and we look forward to hearing what Dr. Marc has to say as the Sami Rosh, and moving on to no longer proto-reformers, but real reformers, Hamburg temples, and all kinds of interesting stuff. Bakasha, Dr. Marc.
That's right. We won't get to Hamburg today, but we'll get to Berlin. The Berlin Temple. I don't know if Ellie's with us, but I did want to show the picture. Here's a picture of the Jewish Center Sanctuary in New York. It just shows how memory plays tricks with you. I lived on the Upper West Side for 4 years. I've been to the shul countless times, but for some reason, I had thought you could see the ark. You see the bima. It's on the stage there, where you daven, the bima is right in front of the Aron Kodesh. For some reason, I was confusing it in my mind with Rome. Here's what Rome looks like. You can see it. They moved it down. It used to be that the bima was right in front of the Aron Kodesh, like in the Jewish Center, but a number of years ago, they moved it so it's in front of the stage, I guess you could call that. Yes. So I showed the picture here, but it just shows you how memory.
I've been there every week for the last 10 years.
Okay. Well, I was also there. I lived on the Upper West Side, but it's been over 20 years. And it's just, I want to give you an example of how you always have to check. So I thank you, because in my mind, I was remembering it as if the bima was in front of the stage. And it's not, and this is a perfect example of what we'll see the Rabbanim were speaking about when the bima was moved to the front, which is very church-like. Although, as we'll see, the Kesef Mishnah doesn't see a problem with it at all. That's the first thing I want to mention.
Thank you. Thank you for that effort.
Thank you for the questions and the corrections. I always appreciate it.
It was one of those things that bothered me in that shul.
Okay, I quoted this book last week from Rav David Cohen. If you notice, his name is Cohen, but it's really Khan. He's not a Cohen, but in English, they write it as Cohen. He's a well-known rabbi in Flatbush, Posek, and I have to say, when the history of the sexual abuse issue is finally written, he will come out very well, because it does seem like now there's been a change, and at least not the elder rabbis, but like the younger generation, when I say younger, like in the 50s, early 60s of the haredi world, is finally taking it seriously after it's already been a generation, decades. But it needs to be said that Rav David Cohen already decades ago was saying that you hear about sexual abuse, you got to go right to the police. And there were people who hated him because of that. And he was, people said all sorts of bad things about him. But when the history is finally written, an honest history of how the Orthodox community responded to child abuse, it's going to be very hard to write the honest history, because the Aguda circles will not want to let their archives open, and what they did to prevent going to the police and things coming out. Rav David Cohen on this issue, say what you will about other issues, on this issue, he from the beginning stood up against his own community and was saying to do the right thing. So Yasher Koach to Rav David Cohen. I mentioned my name last week, Elimelech, and I just repeated Melech. It's really Melech, but people call me Elimelech. It's not. So I repeated the story, the thing that everyone says, that the first Elimelech is Elimelech of Lezhensk. And I said, check the Otzar Rabbanim. The Otzar Rabbanim is a book I have here, which it's 400 pages. It says that it lists every rabbi ever in history of any significance. So I looked in it, and it's not exact. I count 2 Elimelechs, none of whom are at all significant before Elimelech of Lezhensk. So I think you need to say that from Rav Elimelech of Lezhensk, then the name became popular, not that it's first. And then I got an email also saying that from Mike and from Moshe, and he actually sends me an article. Here it is. Is that really true? And also it cites some examples from before. But so if we want to be exact, we could say that the name Elimelech did exist, but it wasn't popular. In terms of names, someone asked me, what do I have to say about non-Jewish names? We spoke about non-Jewish names as a tshuva of Ramosha about this. We've spoken many times about this, about the names like Tarfon and Papa, and even the name Maimon and others. So I don't need to repeat that. But I will say as follows. This is what's interesting, which my daughter's name is Yael. I don't think I've ever mentioned this, so I'll say it. Rav Yaakov Emden states, I even printed it out, just I have for you. Anyone wants to check? It's Biras Migdalos, section Evan Bochen, page, section number 14. He says that Yael, even though she was a tzaddikas, lo haisa Yisraelis. He says that Yael was not Jewish or Israelite. I don't know where he gets that. All the other sources assume she was. The whole discussion about Avera Lishma assumes she was, but Rav Yaakov Emden, for reasons I'm not sure, if any of you can enlighten me as to why he says this. He doesn't say why. He actually repeats this in his Mikpachat Sfarim, which is his attack on the Zohar. He says that Yael, not only is Yael not a Jewish name, Yael was not Jewish. Well, I don't know, Jewish is not the best term in those days, so was not Israelite, I guess you could say, because Jewish is from the tribe of Yehudah. But so that's why he says Israelite. So I find that unusual. And in terms of names, Robbie, thank you for writing to me. I have to, what Robbie says, I knew what Robbie said, but I forgot. I never pay attention to it. Robbie's Englishman. I've mentioned many times Cecil Roth. And as any Englishman knows, it's not Cecil, it's Cecil, just like Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes. So I did know that, but what can I say? As an American, I just keep pronouncing it incorrectly. So I will try from now on to call him by his name, Cecil Roth, since that's how he called himself. Although we have plenty of examples of how we refer to people, not exactly how they called themselves. The person who pointed out that in Hungarian it's temple for synagogue, I wanted to see if this still continues. So we're going to be speaking to Rabbi Oberlander, the Rav of Budapest, this Wednesday. And he says that although among the younger generation, they're now saying synagoga because they don't like to use the word temple, he says his mother, he's from the Papa Hasidic group, she would still, he says, call it templum. So I find that very interesting that in Hungary, that was one of the words they used for a synagogue. Oh, I have a few more minutes, so quickly I can say what I wanted to show you. And then I won't have anything else. This takes us back to last semester with Ramosha Feinstein and reciting Hallel on Pesach night. Lo and behold, I found Ramosha holds that he's very much against the Brisker Rav's position. He says, stay in the shul. If it's not your minhag, we're going to have this in 2 months. Stay in, say Hallel, but don't say it with the bracha. In the Brisker Rav we saw, he's not into that sort of thing. If you're not supposed to say Hallel, don't say Hallel. Bracha, no bracha, you don't do it because it's you don't just do it. So he walk out. In this book, the Ma'aner Igrot, the attack on Rav Moshe. I can send anyone a PDF who wants this. You will not find this book on HebrewBooks.org. You will not find it on Otzer Chachma. There's a boycott against this book, which I think is wrong. It's true, the author is a mechutzaf, and he speaks disrespectfully about Rav Moshe, but he makes many good points. It's full of learning. Rav Vad Yosef quotes it. Every time he quotes it, he says that but the author should have spoken with more respect to Rav Moshe. I understand when the book came out, it looks just like the Igros Moshe, the same publisher. In fact, when the printer was printing it, he realized what it was, and he called Rav Moshe, and he said, this is recorded in the biography of Moshe. What should he do? Well, he has a contract, and he doesn't want to print it. And Moshe says, you can print it, but, because you lose money otherwise. So he printed it, but none of the Sfarim stores would carry it. I got my copy from the author himself. He's no longer alive, but I got my copy. But like I said, there's a boycott, which I think is wrong because it's a part of a Torah history. There's a lot of learning in it, and if we're going to start censoring, I understand because Ramosha is closer to our time. We knew Ramosha. But at the end of the day, if we're going to start censoring all the books that say disrespectful things, I just mentioned Rav Yaakov Enden. Forget Rav Yonah Sinai-Pshitz. He says disrespectful things about lots of people. Are we going to start censoring the Torah literature, the Satmar Rebbe, what he says, Rav Shach? I mean, you can't start, I don't believe in cancel culture in the Torah world. So, but it's a collector's item, I can tell you that. And I do have a PDF of it because some, I think he's probably a Satmar guy, made a PDF of it. But on Simon, I am Gimel, he goes against Rav Moshe. He's always going against Rav Moshe. Either Rav Moshe is too lenient or Rav Moshe is too strict. Rav Moshe can never get it right. But he has a whole tshuva here say that no, there's nothing wrong with saying halal, even if it's not your minhag. If you're in a show where they say it with a bracha, you go ahead and say it with mutar le'lomar halal bevracha. He says he has no problem. This is Rav Yom Tov Halevi Schwartz, the same author of this wonderful book called Eyes to See in English. It was translated in Hebrew, in which he shows such an ethical sensitivity. I don't know how the author of this work, Eyes to See, is the same one who wrote the Man Netlig wrote, which, as I said, is unfortunately a big chutzpahdik attack against the Posei Kador, but a very interesting book, nevertheless. And finally, we have 3 more minutes. This I think you'll find interesting. At the end, we also spoke, it was the first class, I believe, in this series about violating Shabbos for non-natural remedies. And I think it was Bill mentioned that something about Rav Chaim Heller and the Rav. I found it, but then, and also Moshe sent me also. It's in Mipnini Harav, page 81 by Rav Shechter. It tells this great story from Rabbi Rees that once on Simchas Torah, the Rav was learning with a bunch of students, and the phone rang, and of course, the phone rang, and the Rav gets up and he goes to the next room. And he picks it up and he starts speaking on the phone on Yom Tov. And the Rav comes back and he sees the students. Of course, they're a little surprised. What's the Rav doing talking? The Rav is not like Rabbi Rachman. Rabbi Rachman held that you could talk on the phone on Yom Tov. The Rav didn't hold this. But he told them the story as follows, that in the morning, before he went to shul, the telephone was ringing, just kept ringing, and they wouldn't answer it. After davening, they came back home in the middle of lunch. A non-Jewish neighbor rings the doorbell and he tells them that he has a telegram for Rav Soloveitchik. And Rav Soloveitchik says to him, we don't open it. So the man understood whatever. He opened the telegram, and the telegram said, answer the phone, Chaim Heller. And what was the story? Rav Chaim Heller was in Lakewood over Yom Tov, and he became quite ill, and the doctor says he immediately needs to have an operation, and he did not want to have this operation without consulting with Rav Soloveitchik. So Rav Soloveitchik was speaking to Rav Chaim Heller, and that was regarded as, I don't know if on Yom Tov it has to be Pikuach Nefesh, but it was a serious matter, and that's the story that Bill told. Furthermore, in Megid Givot Olam on page 101, he records, this is Rabbi Shurkin, Rabbi Michal Shurkin, also a student of the Rav, that the Vilna Gaon held that about a certain tzaddik, I guess maybe more than one, you could violate Shabbos to get a bracha from him. And Rav Moshe Feinstein himself in the Igros Moshe, volume 8, Orach Chaim, number 16, says that you can write a kameya on Shabbos if you're worried that without it the person will die. In other words, if the person feels that he needs this kameya, you can do it. And the last thing I'll mention, Rav Nachum Rabinovich in his Tshuvot Siach Nachum, he goes even further. He says that social workers are allowed to travel on Shabbos if there's a terrorist attack, if they could, because the trauma is such, it's the equivalent of a chola sheyesh bo sakana, and he cites the Rashba, that the Rashba says to say that you can also write a kameya on Shabbos for a chola sheyesh bo sakana, or for a woman who just gave birth to calm her. and that was what I suggested, that could possibly be a permission. Okay, so now I have no other things in my pile until everyone else sends me more stuff. So let's pick up. Got my story in here. We were in the middle, if you remember, about we're talking about Israel Jacobson and David Friedlander, reformers. The last thing I was talking about was Israel Jacobson in Zizen, his synagogue there. And he says as follows: why create a reform service? He says, quote, "Who would dare deny that our service is sickly because of many useless things?" That is, you're saying all this stuff in the prayers that are useless. I don't know what he considers useless and what's not. I'm not sure, but I think for him, maybe only Shema and a reformed version of Shemona Esrei would be valuable. I don't know. And then he goes on, this has degenerated into a thoughtless recitation of prayers and formulae, that it kills devotion more than it encourages it, and that it limits our religious principles to that fund of knowledge which for centuries has remained in our treasure house without increase and without ennoblement. So he says it kills devotion. It's a thoughtless recitation of prayers and formulae. Now, this is something obviously the Orthodox struggle with as well. No one can deny that people, as I said, it's the routinization. So the Orthodox, though, have to do their own way of trying to make it. We don't cut things out unless they're like matters that are not really essential to the davening. But the thing with the reformers is they often had a good diagnosis of what was going on. Their solutions were the problems, but of course there's a diagnosis that the people find certain aspects of the service long and boring, and we've made changes when halakhically you could. I've said it numerous times. Just look at the Tisha B'Av that you have today and compare that to when we were growing up, where I'd sit in shul for as a youngster, hours and hours listening to keynotes. What's a 12 or 13-year-old supposed to do when you can't understand these keynotes and they just read them again and again? So now we've made changes. So, but that's, there's halachic principles as well. But the reformers are not so concerned about that. And then he says that these prayers have remained in our treasure houses without increase or ennoblement. That is, we have to change the prayers because we can't recite prayers the same way they've been recited for 1,000 years, 2,000 years. We need some changes. Now, I just want to take back a bit what I said, that in terms of, make it seem it's only the reformers, because there's a video of an interview. There's a guy, he deals with high school kids. I could find it, I forget his name. And he interviews with Herschel Schechter. And he says that at a lot of our high schools, the kids come in and they don't want to daven. They don't come from such religious homes, or they're teenagers. They're not so into it often. So Rav Schechter says to him, so then they don't have to daven all this. And I don't know, the person was a little surprised. He says, so what should they do? So Rav Schechter says, okay, he says, cut out this, cut out the Psukkah Zimra. I think he says, do Brach Shamar, and then go to Ashrei, and then I think he says, then go to Birkos Kriyat Shema. In other words, he cuts out. So it's like a 15-minute or even less, a 10-minute davening. And this is not some reformer. This is Rav Schechter saying, for these kids, it's better to say a few things with kavana than to have them sit there the whole time so they're born out of their mind. So by the time they get to the Shema, they're still thinking of the sports game from the night before that they've been thinking for the last 10 minutes. So this is, the posek of Schechter saying that, for those people, we're not talking about a shul here. A shul is problematic, but for the high school kids, and you could have, I guess, different minyanim. You could have the minyan for the kids who want to do everything and the kids who aren't up to it. And I found that interesting that Rav Schechter said that. Now, you might be thinking that, we've added a great deal to Judaism in recent years, but from Jacobson's point, nothing is new. Everything just comes out of the same old sources. And since we're living in a different era, as we'll see, we need entirely new conceptions. And if we're bound to Jewish law, then there's going to be limits to what we can do. So people like Jacobson aren't going to be happy. Now, Jacobson also was concerned with fitting in. Remember, at the synagogue, the inauguration was full of non-Jews, and they too joined into the singing and everything. I can tell you that at the inauguration of the shul that I go to, there were also non-Jews at the inauguration. The mayor was there, the assembly people, and they didn't speak, but they sat. Actually, I shouldn't say that. The mayor spoke, I should say. But the rest of them just sat there. I remember the mayor spoke. He spoke very ecumenically about all our houses of worship and everything, and very nice. But we didn't have psalms or hymns that we sang together with them. But Jacobson says as follows. He says that parts of the Jewish prayer service and the rituals are offensive to reason. That is, they offend us. So we say things that we don't accept, we don't believe in. And then he says as well, also to our Christian friends. So this is going to be driving reform also, that they need to fit in, not just in their understanding of what it means to be a modern person, but they don't want to do things that non-Jews will look at and say, well, that's retrograde or that's backwards. Later, in his speech at the inauguration and speaking to the Christians, he says, quote, there is nothing in this new temple that in any way contradicts the principles of pure religion, of the demands of general morality, of reason, of your humanitarian attitude. Of course, we today in 2022, we would never say to the non-Jews, if we, dedication of our shul, there's nothing that we do in here that's in opposition to your humanitarianism. And we wouldn't feel the need to say that everything we do in here is in accord with pure religion, with general morality. That we assume that everyone knows that synagogues were interested in morality. But you see that in the early part of the 19th century, he needs to stress that we're not different than you. We too are moral, and we're not, this synagogue, unlike those other synagogues, is a synagogue where a Christian can come and feel brotherhood with the Jews because we all are worshiping the one true God. You won't find in this synagogue any of that Orthodox mumbo jumbo and superstition. I do want to add, however, that many people are probably thinking when you hear this, that's so reformed to be concerned with the goyim. Always what the goyim have to say, and we're going to modify our service and we're going to change our practices because of the goyim. And I have to say that there is a lot of truth to that feeling, but it's not complete without pointing out that we have plenty of examples where Orthodox or Torah leaders, because I don't want to use the word Orthodox, I'm speaking about, let's say in medieval times, they're not Orthodox. There's no such thing as Orthodoxy yet. We haven't even got to Orthodoxy. Maybe with the Chasam Sofer, we'll start seeing Orthodoxy, right? We just have Torah Judaism and Reform Judaism, traditional Torah Judaism and Reform Judaism, because we have a number of examples. I'll just give you some of them now, where poskim, Torah leaders have said that because of how things look to the Goyim, we should not do it. And let me give you a few examples. I should have asked Rabbi Desani about this a couple of weeks ago, the chief rabbi of Rome. In Rome, before the mid-19th century, one of the practices they used to do was they would drag the coffin of rabbis, only rabbis. They would drag the coffin, and this was thought to be a form of penitence. This is based on the idea that Chizkiyahu, to give penance to his wicked father, dragged his father's bones. So they would drag the coffin, and this created problems because the non-Jews would look at this. This is, then they dump it into they didn't let it down nicely into the grave. They'd actually push it in. And this was like skila. This was like the punishment of stoning, like you throw someone off high roof or something. And in fact, the tzaddikim in Rome would do all four types of punishments after their death. There was a whole formula they did as a form of penitence. Now, this created negative feelings among the non-Jewish Romans. Can you imagine? They'd see the people dragging the coffin through the streets. The good thing is, however, was that this was only done for the sages, and they only did it every 40, 50 years once. So it wasn't such a big deal. But nevertheless, it was mocked during the carnival performances in Rome. And in fact, for over 200 years, the Jews of Rome asked the various popes to forbid the performances where they used to mock the Jewish funeral practices. And it was finally abolished by the Jews in the 19th century because they had a rabbi there. He was the Rav of Rome. He wasn't from Rome. He was from Eretz Yisrael. He came to Rome. His name was Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan. And he wrote a volume of Tshuvot, a very interesting volume called the Krach Shel Romi. Rabbi Professor Jose Faur has a whole book on Yisrael Moshe Chazan, a very fascinating figure. Well, if you look in his responsa, number 13, he talks about how, contrary to what the general minhag was, a simple person, Chazan calls him Pashut Echad, a simple person, said he also wanted to be given the Daled Misos basted. He also wanted to be given the 4 mitot and to be dragged. I have to look in the tshuva. As I remember, you drag in the coffin. You're not dragged by yourself. I'm going to look, though, because now I'm thinking of it. That would be even worse if you actually drag the body. But I'm pretty certain that that's my recollection, that they drag the coffin, not the body. Because they do bury coffins in Rome. Now, this is again going to be a problem. You're going to drag him into the cemetery, which goes to the non-Jewish neighborhoods. And Rabbi Moshe Chazan says when we did it with the big rabbis, it was a very uncommon thing. But now you have simple people want to do this. And that's going to create a mockery for Judaism. We now have good relations with the Christians. Can you imagine what that's going to do when they see us dragging, dead people through the streets? It's going to make us, he says, seem like barbarians in their eyes. And therefore, he abolishes it. Is this a valid concern? Are we supposed to alter our practices because of the non-Jews? We don't stop doing mitzvot because of the non-Jews, but there are other sources I found similarly. So, for instance, the Rashbash. The Rashbash is Shlomo ben Shimon Duran, 15th century Algeria. He responds to a community where the minhag was when you went into the shul, you took off your shoes. We know that's what they did outside the cities, for example, in the villages, they did that. Did they get this from the Muslims, that this was a sign of respect? It could be. I can tell you that right now in Jerba, and by the way, I'm going back to Jerba the week after Shavuos. I got to get our trip. God willing, one day we'll go, but I got to plan it. I was going to announce to everyone one day that we're the first kosher tour from America ever going to Jerba. But lo and behold, my friend there, my contact, told me, I spoke to him last week. The group just left. A group of Hasidim, 17 Hasidim, showed up in Tunisia last week, and they're the first kosher tour. And in their whole garb and everything, the Hasidim there. But I can tell you that in every single shul in Jerba, when you go up to the Aron Kodesh, and I had the kavod of taking out the Torah one, but you have to take your shoes off. And in the famous shul in Jerba, the Griba shul, the big one there, everyone takes their shoes off before you go in the shul. So you're all davening in the shul. It doesn't matter. And when you come as a tourist, you have to take your shoes off too. So the whole shul for thousands of years, you've been taking your shoes off there. So it's not I think it's Rav Chaim Kanievsky, actually, or the state board. No, it's Rav Chaim Kanievsky. He was asked about the practice of taking your shoes off, and he says it's like from the Goyim. But it's not. We have it in Morocco. We know that they used to do it. Well, maybe originally it's from the Goyim, but I mean, it's been a Jewish practice for so long that it's a valid Jewish practice. So, but he was asked about this, the Rashbash. Now, there was a shul where some people insisted on taking your shoes off, and other people said, no, you can't take your shoes off because this is, again, you're imitating the Goyim. And what does the Rashbash say? And this is, there's a few different Durans. It's Hashbetz, the Rashbash, but these are major poskim. He says you should take off your shoes. And he says, precisely by taking off your shoes, you'll gain respect by the non-Jews. Because for the Muslims, the idea of going to your house of worship and not taking off your shoes was a sign of disrespect. So it's not like taking off your shoes is against halakha. There's good reasons to take off your shoes, you could argue. And therefore, now you can never imagine a posek in a Christian man saying this, take off your shoes. They would see this as completely disrespectful, take off your shoes. Take off your shoes when you go to shul, that's the height of disrespect. But in the Muslim world, on the contrary, you have to have a good reason not to take off your shoes, because in that world, it was thought to be respectful to take your shoes off. You know that the Rambam says that before davening, you're supposed to wash your feet. And the Raivad on the spot there in Hilchos Tefillah says, what's going on here? Why would you wash your feet? He doesn't. So it's a very different understanding. The Rambam has a famous example. Take a look in the Chuvas Rambam, the Blau edition, number 258. That's the tshuva where he deals with the practice of no chazaras hashatz. And this continues in Spanish and Portuguese. They don't do this on Shabbos and Musaf. You read it together. That is, you restarted the Shemona Esrei at Musaf. Only at Musaf, as I recall, they do this out loud, and then you get to Kedusha, and then everyone continue on your own. What they call the Hecha Kedusha. Yeshivas do it sometimes. This was standard in Morocco. Today, it's not so common, although often on trips and things, you do it in the interest of time. But the Rambam defended this practice. And a lot of people know why he defended it. He said there's a lot of talking. He doesn't just say he's talking, by the way. He also says, the Jews are spitting also. They're just acting, they're showing their disrespect. But then he says, so that's what people often quote. But he says as follows. He says, by getting rid of the chazaras hashatz, where the Jews spit and talk and all that, he says, Yusar chil Hashem shenispashet bein hagoyim. He says that this creates a chil Hashem. So the Jews not behaving properly in shul creates a chil Hashem for the goyim, and therefore the Rambam says that's a good reason. I don't know if it was just the Jews talking and spitting, if that would have been a reason enough to abolish it without the chil Hashem. And this tshuva is cited by the Radbaz in volume 4, number 5. He cites the Rambam and he summarizes it as follows: that why is this such a big deal? He says, the Radbaz says that precisely because in the Muslim world they're very makpid. They don't talk during davening and they don't do any of these other things. So therefore, that's the reason why the Rambam felt that you have to get rid of. It's important to get rid of the chazaras hashatz. Now, chazaras hashatz, this is a religious thing. This is part of our religious ritual. So you see that how the non-Jews thought about us, it's going to make a disgrace in front of the non-Jews. That's reason enough to stop it. I'll give you 2 more examples of this. The Magen Avraham says that technically, if we want to hire, let's say I want to build a shul. So we hire the non-Jews to build it. We don't tell them when to build it. We're going to give them $100,000 to build this shul. They can do it when they want. They want to build it on Shabbos, on Yom Kippur, they can do that. Halakhically, there's no problem with that. However, the Magen Avraham says, since non-Jews do not allow work to take place at their churches on Sunday, it would be a disgrace if we Jews on our day of rest would allow workers to work on it. And the Chasam Sofer writes that this is a new idea of the Magen Avraham, his own idea, his own chiddush, and yet the Chasam Sofer accepts it. He likes this. There were those who opposed the Magen Avraham's view, the Rabbi Akiva Eiger, the father-in-law of the Chasam Sofer. But this became accepted, and I think it's been pretty much accepted by all poskim today. I don't think that today you could have. I can't imagine today, if we're building a shul, that on Shabbos or Yom Tov we could allow workers to be working on it. I don't think that would happen. And this all goes back to the Magen Avraham. Actually, today non-Jews work on Sunday, so you can make the argument that it's not such a big deal anymore, but I don't think it would happen. I'll give you one final example, because we have some Germans with us here. Rav David Zvi Hoffman, I think it's Tshuva 14 maybe, or 15 in Malamed Holwell. He was asked about smoking in shul. Let's say you come to shul and can you smoke? Smoke during the weekday, obviously. And he says that the non-Jews are careful not to smoke in the church. And therefore, we can't smoke in the shul. I don't think he's referring to during davening. I think he's referring to just like you're in a shul, you're learning or you're just hanging out. But he says Christians will never smoke in the church, and therefore it's a chil Hashem, so we can't do it. There's other examples. The Rabbi Bryce Yaakov, as I recall, says you can't bring a dog into a shul, even like a seeing eye dog, because the non-Jews don't bring it into church. He criticizes Rav Moshe Feinstein for permitting AID, artificial insemination, because he says that the Catholics don't allow it, and therefore it's a chilul Hashem. And Ramosha says, in that case, Ramosha says, who cares what the Catholics say? If the Torah allows it, then we have a good reason, we do it. So just remember this and keep it in mind that it's not totally a foreign concern that we have to be, just have no interest what the non-Jews think about us. The reformers, though, this becomes their major concern. The other figure we spoke about is David Friedlaender. David Friedlaender, here's the article from the encyclopedia. It says encyclopedia.com, but it's Encyclopedia Judaica. You can read a whole article about David Friedlander, 1750, 1834. He fell in with Mendelssohn's circle. He was even more radical than Jacobson. Here they quote something that he writes, that he said. He proposed substituting in prayers in place of the messianic hope, say as follows: I stand here before God. I pray for blessing and prosperity for my compatriots, for myself and my family, not for the return to Jerusalem, not for the restoration of the temple and sacrifices. I do not harbor these wishes in my heart. He also, as it says, proposes that instead of Gemara, Talmudic law, we should study the laws of the country. You see how that would work? So instead of studying Bava Metzia, we study, the rules, New York State rules on torts. Not so interesting, but so that's David Friedlander. Well, what do I mean when I say David Friedlander is even more extreme than Jacobson? Well, they both wanted a reform of the Siddur, the prayer book, but Friedlander wanted to get rid of all of Hebrew. What good is Hebrew anymore? Let's have it in the vernacular in German. Furthermore, Friedlander wanted to move the Shabbos to Sunday. And there were Reform synagogues, including in America, that some really extreme ones that for a time had the Sabbath on Sunday. But I don't think there is any Reform synagogue in the world today. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's so many learned people listen to me. But is there any Reform synagogue in the world today that has the Sabbath prayers synagogue service on Sunday? Maybe, but I don't think so. But there were some in Europe who had it. He also objected to the confirmation ceremony, which Jacobson had, and which was taken from the Christians, because when you have a confirmation ceremony, that implies that there's a confession of faith. And Friedlander said there is no confession of faith. For him, I guess extreme reform, you could say, was the alternative to conversion, but his radical views were never accepted in future generations. Okay, so let me pick up again with Jacobson, because this is where it starts. This is where we start seeing the conflict now with the Orthodox. Because Jacobson moves to Berlin and he resumes his reformist activities. In 1815, his son is confirmed at age 13 at a private home. And from that time on, every Shabbos, he held private services. And since they were private, the community didn't pay them much regard, even though technically you were not allowed to have private services. Jacobson gave the sermon. The sermon was always the highlight of the Reform service, and it's not just it's the highlight; it's the most important part. The sermon, I think we can say that even to this day, the sermon is so important in the non-Orthodox. The non-Orthodox already in the summer, the beginning of the summer, they start planning their Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Kol Nidre sermons. Because for many, we see our rabbis every week. So if they don't have a good sermon one week, fine, we'll get them the next week. We're not, it's not the biggest, and we all know that that's not how we judge the rabbis. Good sermons, that's a plus, but the Rav does many more important things. I would even say, and maybe some of you are going to be very angry and I'm going to get shot for this, but I think there's probably an inverse ratio. Those who take their Yiddishkeit seriously, the sermon is least important. Those who the sermon is the most important, it's that they're really missing out because they think that that's what it's about, hearing the sermon. That's the rabbi's job. That's something we made the rabbis do, but the rabbi teaches Torah and he does chesed and all these other things. Be that as it may, so I was saying, so they reform, they spend so much time on their sermon. So that was the center of it. The sermon was, as we've spoken about, what's the job of a sermon? It's not a drasha. It's not, although we call it a drasha today, it's not a point of Torah understanding. It's supposed to deepen devotion, give a feeling of religious edification. As I've said it again and again, try getting up in a shul as a Rav and say, Rashi asked a question, try to explain what Rashi's saying and give an answer and sit down. People look at you like, what's going on here? If you don't finish the sermon by with some motivational message that we should all be zoche to this and that, then it's not a sermon. That's what a sermon is. You come with us this summer, God willing, we'll come to Budapest. You'll see there's no sermon in that Orthodox shul, because that's a real Orthodox shul. Instead, during Kiddush, we're sitting around with the kugel and the cholent, then the Rav will speak in Yiddish, usually. Sometimes he'll speak in Hebrew if there's a lot of Israelis there. And that's an old-fashioned drasha. No edification, but okay. So we have edification, nothing wrong with it. In our world, we could use some of that, but that's the difference between a sermon and a drasha. And the preachers all drew on German models, and in Jacobson's synagogue, which is in the house, private home, very nice home, as we'll see, there was an organ, still played by a non-Jew, though, with German hymns and a choir. The service, we know, went from 8 to 10 in the morning, and the prayers were mostly in Hebrew. We will later come to Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, and we'll discuss his sermons, because he also does sermons the modern way. In Jacobson's synagogue, Berlin synagogue, the Torah is read in Sephardi Hebrew without the musical accents. I cannot explain why, but the early reformers thought that there was something barbaric with trup. To me, it would be the most boring thing just to listen to someone read the psukim without a tune. How can anyone deal with that? The tune is what gives it a sense of you're part of the davening and you can pay attention to it. But I guess it's just a different sense, just like organ music doesn't do it for me in the synagogue. And for them, they thought that was the most important thing. For some reason, these highly intellectual, enlightened German Jews thought that trup was something inappropriate. So instead they just read like Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Maybe there was some sort of feeling in how they read it. If Yaakov gets angry, maybe they read it with different feeling, you can change the intonation, but there was no trup. And they read it with Sardic pronunciation, which is really wild because this isn't like today when we're being taught in our day schools. They're teaching us Ivrit because that's what they do in Israel. No one recited it to the Sardic unless you were a Svardi. And there are very few Svardim in Germany. There were a few in Hamburg. They still had some there. But as far as I know, there were no Svardim, no Svardic synagogues in Berlin. We'll get to in a minute why they did that. Furthermore, to show you how they were imitating, so they're imitating the Sephardim in another thing. They did not call people up to an aliyah with their names. And that is, if you go today to Sephardic shuls, to Syrian shuls, but not all, Moroccans call up with names, but it's a common practice in the Sephardic world not to call people up by their names. I don't know why the Sephardim have that practice, or many of the Sephardim. And I also don't know why the Ashkenazim, the people like Jacobson, thought that this was to call up people with names, that this is undignified. They were all about dignity. I understand what dignity is. I understand when Rabbi Joseph Luxstein decided that he had to get rid of the spittoons in KJ, Kiruv Jeshurun. And there was a revolt from all the old timers. How could you have a shul without spittoons? And he said, that's what the Rambam was speaking about, the people spitting. He said, this is America. You don't have spittoons, So I understand that's not dignified. What's not dignified about calling up someone up by their name? We even know that this created halachic issues. The famous case in Hungary, I'll talk about on a trip this summer, where a guy, his family, the father, converted to Christianity. So how do you call him up on Shabbos for an aliyah? You can't call him up by his father's name because the father became a Meshumad. So do you call him up by the grandfather's name? Do you just Ben Avraham? So it's a whole dispute. But they changed that. And as I said, though, Moroccan shuls and the Moroccan minhags also come from Spain. So I don't know why maybe the original minhag in the Sephardic world is to call up by names. I don't know. I'll tell you something. Some of you like the tidbits I throw out. So hold on. Here's one for you. Take a look at the Sefer by a rabbi, not a famous rabbi, Klein. I think his first name is Avraham. well, it must be Avraham. It's Beiros Avraham is the name of the Chuvot. He's the father. There was the volume was published by his son. His son was Samuel Klein. He was Hungarian, but he was the great geographer. He was at the Hebrew University, an expert on Israel geography, wrote a number of works. But in the Chuvot number 6 at the end, he says, he's speaking about the practice, and he says that he cites the Sefer that there was a minhag Ashkenaz that for the last Aliyah, they wouldn't call you up by your name. The rest they would call you by your name, but the last Aliyah they wouldn't. And the halachic implication of this was, therefore, you could call Shishi and Shvi 2 brothers. This is in the Sefer Emunah Shmuel. He's citing, since you don't call the 7th by the name, I've never heard such a practice. And in the note, the son says, because the father points out that the Svardim don't call it by names. He says that in Bosnia, I guess that's what Bet Vav Samech Nun Aleph, Bosna, I think that's Bosnia. They would call the 7th Aliyah, they call Mashlim, the Mashlim Aliyah, but they do mention his name. So, and then he says, so that's also a strange practice. Okay, so now why are they using the Sardic pronunciation? And I guess I see that they think it's undignified to call by names. I don't think they were doing that, got rid of that because of Svardi. Maybe they did, I don't know. But the Sardic pronunciation, every Ashkenazi has, and when I say Sephardic pronunciation, I think that just means that instead of suf, they said tough, and things like that. I don't think it means that kamatz and patach, they pronounced the same. I don't think an Ashkenazi from Germany could do that physically. It would be too tough, I think. Rav Nosson Ador, who taught himself how to speak like a Svardi, he had to learn this from one of these Meshulachim from Israel, Rav Chaim Modai. He's the author of a Sefer. A Sefer Shelos Tshuvos. He taught Rav Nosson Ador this. It took a long time. But so why did they do this? We do not have any contemporaneous explanation saying why they changed the Sephardic pronunciation, but I think the reason is obvious. And Ismar Shorsh, former chancellor of the seminary, who was a scholar of German Jewish history, he wrote a good deal on it, and he has an article called "The Myth of Sephardi Supremacy," and in which he shows that many of these early reformers, not just reformers, the early Wissenschaft scholars, all these early German Jews, they had a very high view of the Sephardi culture, which to them was, it was open to Western civilization, I should say, I don't want to say Western civilization, but to non-Jewish civilization. Look at the Rambam, look at Yehuda Halevi, look at the Golden Age of Spain, and they contrasted that with the Hasidei Ashkenaz and with Rashi. And the Ashkenazic tradition, they were alienated from their own tradition because they look at their own tradition, and what do you have? Torah only. That's the Ashkenazic tradition in Germany. They were much happier with the Sephardic tradition. And furthermore, look at their synagogues they built, even some Orthodox. They all were all this Oriental model they built. So Sephardi supremacy. Amazingly, the day school, the Reformed day school in the Boston area is called the Rashi School. You can be sure they would have preferred to call themselves Maimonides, but Rabbi Soloveitchik already took that name. And I could see Maimonides, you could make the case, he's open-minded. Everyone used to say, the reformers used to say that we follow Maimonides because the important thing is not what Maimonides said about Jewish law, it's what he would have said if he was living today. And then the reformers love to follow Maimonides. Hirsch himself criticizes Maimonides because he says the reasons that Rambam gave for various mitzvot, it allowed the reformers to say, see, look at the Rambam. He gave these explanations, but today the explanations don't apply, so we don't have to do these mitzvot. Obviously, the Rambam never intended that, but Hirsch's point was that the Rambam should have seen what would come from offering these speculative explanations. But Rashi, no one in their wildest imagination can find any connection of Rashi to Reform. So it's a little offensive, if you ask me, that the Reform, when they create their school, they call it the Rashi School. There's so many other names they could have. You can call it, Shmuel HaNagid. You can Yehuda Halevi. You can pick someone at least who had, not that these people didn't were reformers. They obviously accepted halakha, but at least they were open towards the Western world. But to call a reform school Rashi, it's hard to say it. That's all I can say. When Sunz, Leopold Sunz, the founder of academic Jewish studies in Germany in the first half of the 19th century, he attended the Yom Kippur service of Jacobson in Berlin, and he was very impressed, and he wrote as follows. Listen to this. People who for 20 years had no communion with Jews spent the whole day there. That is, people who couldn't go to the Orthodox shul because they didn't have any connection. All of a sudden, a new synagogue opens up, Jacobson synagogue, which the only reform really is there's some German hymns and things, and there's a non-Jew playing an organ, but the synagogue service is basically the same. The siddur is not entirely the same, but pretty much the same. So these people come back to shul. Quote, men who believe themselves already beyond religious emotion spilled tears of devotion. The majority of the young people fasted. So here you see something we don't often notice. Reform as a vehicle of kiruv. In the midst of a battle with the Orthodox, you can't expect the Gedolim to see anything positive in it. But here you see reform actually serving as a form of kiruv. People who would be completely assimilated and intermarrying at least are feeling some connection. And this is the beginning of the recognition that not everyone, if all you have is an Orthodox synagogue, lots of people are not going to go to it. They just won't go to shul. So here you have the Reformed synagogue, later the conservative synagogue, at least giving them something. Now we have a new phenomenon that we couldn't imagine 30 years ago, the Chabad synagogue. The Chabad synagogue is an Orthodox synagogue, but it's not your local community Orthodox synagogue. It's a synagogue designed specifically for people like this, and they have no issues. They love it. And the people who are not observant at all, they go to the shul. So but that's a new thing that the genius of Chabad created it. You did not have that before. So you had people, we had the non-observant Orthodox who used to come to Orthodox shuls, but in more recent years, especially in the big cities, we've lost that. You go to New Jersey, the big towns near where I am, you could have a shul of 500 families, everyone is Shomer Shabbos. So what happened to all the people who used to come? Well, who used to send their kids to Hebrew school? Well, they don't go to the Orthodox. They either don't go or they go to the non-observant. This is an important point for another reason. I was a scholar in residence at a shul, which was officially Orthodox, but it had done some reforms of sort. And I was told when I went there that I should say something about it. And what was one of the reforms? I get to the shul. The shul was basically, it functioned Orthodox. The only reform was that when they read Kriyas Torah, they faced the community. As you know, we read Kriyas Torah, we have to put the Torah, we face the Aron Kodesh. They turned it around, which is like they do in conservative synagogues, I'm told. It's not really halacha, as far as I know, how you face, but this isn't the Jewish way. The Jewish way, you face the Aron Kodesh. So I went there completely expecting to tell the student, because the student was a sort of student of mine. I mean, the rabbi was a student of mine of sorts. So I was fully prepared to tell him that I don't really think this is a good thing. I get there. And I don't want to reveal too much who it is, but it was a city. He opened up a new shul, and I see people there, and I'm speaking to them. These are people who haven't been to shul, some of them in years, and they never go to the Orthodox shul because they weren't observant. And he explained to me that when they opened the shul, this is what the people wanted. For whatever reason, the synagogue they remembered, this is what they did. And he thought this was a compromise worth doing. So this individual was attacked by the other rabbis in the town as doing some reform. Again, this is like a minor reform, but it was a reform, no question about it. But on the other hand, after hearing from him and hearing from the people, I thought that, it's not for me to tell him, because these are people who literally would not be in shul had it not been for this shul. And we already know that the Rav and others gave permission to be a rabbi in a shul without a machitza for kiruv for limited periods of time. And if this guy, everything was halachic, everything was hashkafic even, except for this mini reform. Now, look, I was skeptical. Would they really not come if you turned it around? And his plan was, I guess, to turn it around eventually. But when I went there, we read the Torah facing the wrong direction. It seemed to me, at least, that this was a minor compromise worthwhile. I see it's already 9:25. What we're going to pick up next time is the fascinating thing, because the Torah Jews in Berlin, they decide they are not going to let this synagogue go on. And it's time to shut it down. And then this is going to lead to the great dispute. Again, something that today none of us would even think of, that we shut down well, maybe in Israel they shut down the non-Orthodox, but those of us living in Chutz La'aretz, the idea that we want to shut down, first of all, we don't, if they want to go, live and let live, but wait till you see what the Orthodox tried to do, and then wait till you see the Reform response. They say, well, we don't need these rabbis in Germany because we'll have our other rabbis. And that's going to bring us to the very first halachic work about the Reform movement, Noga HaTzedek, a very, very rare book. And that leads to Elo Divrei Abris. So we're going to get right into the machlokas next week. But let me make a note where we stopped here. See the questions. We've covered a lot today. Let's see. Yeah, someone points out also that Rav David Cohen, he's had, unfortunately, many cases of abuse and has seen firsthand. But I'm going to even say, even without that, even before he saw that, I just think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think he saw clearly that the whole haredi approach to this, I never understood. If I come home and my wife tells me that our Jewish neighbor came in and beat her up, you're saying I'm not supposed to call the police? Would anyone say I'm not supposed to call the police? I have to go to Beis Din or something? And no one. So I mean, how is that different than if it's my 5-year-old child? I can't understand this. And if my Jewish neighbor burns my house down, I'm not supposed to go to the police. I'm supposed to go to Beis Din or something. If I'm beaten up by someone on the street, a Jewish guy decides to beat me up and rob all my money, I'm supposed to go to Beis Din. No one would say to do that, because these are wild people. They don't care about Beis Din, even if there was such a concept. So why, if it's a child is being sexually abused, that you go to Beis Din? I never understand it. And I think, unfortunately, the Chaim Walder case is going to change this. Ruth says that Yael was a Canaanite, but I don't know. Do we know that? I mean, I think we assume that Yael was a Jewish. That's how they assume. The whole discussion about Avera Lishma, when they say that Yael, what she did was a sin, but one of these sins that you have a reason for doing, they assume, other than Rav Yaakov Emden, as far as I know, everyone assumes that Yael was an Israelite.
She's married to a Canaanite. She's Ashes Chaver HaCanaanite. Why can't she just be? Why does she have to be Jewish?
I don't know, because I have no idea. But that's how it's described in the sources.
Well, and also non-Jews are mitzuvim not to kill people.
Well, no, the killing wasn't the problem. The problem was sleeping with the sexual act that she did. That was the issue. She was good to kill him. That's not the issue.
But they whitewash Esther, so it's not fair.
Okay. By the way, I mean, it's not so clear. I mean, I don't know. Was she really married to him, or does that just means that she was from like the Canaanite groups? I don't know.
Why? Then that's even worse.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's I think what Yaakov Emden is thinking. That that's maybe where Yaakov. Well, you're right. Either way, maybe that's shot, but I don't know. I haven't seen it. Okay, thank you. So Sharon and Marty, what about the famous song which begins Anaz de Rabbi Elimelech? That's Elimelech of Lezhensk. That's the thing. That's the legend that Elimelech of Lezhensk is the first Elimelech. My son went on the March of the Living, whatever. When the yeshiva kids go to Israel, I don't think they call it March of the Living. So one of the graves they go to is Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk. He did that a few months ago. And the legend is the story, which I sort of thought it was true. I never investigated it, though. It didn't take me long to investigate. I just had to open up the Otzer Rabbanim. And there's two who predate him. Two rabbis who I never heard of, not well known, but that's the Rebbe Elimelech. Yael has a clear theophoric in the name, so that position seems strange. Yeah, you mean, yeah, well, Bethel, Beit-El, non-Jews, that was ancient Babel, Bavel, although I know they give an etymology, Balal, but we know that the term El is used for all the word El itself is used for not just Jews, non-Jews, gods, everything. Oh, that's Ellen, I think, was pointing out.
No, Yael doesn't even have an aleph in it.
Yeah, okay. You're right. It doesn't have it. I was thinking of it. You're right. That's I should know that. I always avoid. I'm listening to what I'm reading the text here. The same thing happened to me with Nivel Peh, and I should know that. My daughter's name is Yael, although we call her Yaeli. Yeah, I don't know the root of Yael. Yeah, I don't know.
It's a
But
gazelle.
like I said, if you look in the Gemara and in the commentators, they go off all onto this whole thing of Eero Shema. If you're just dealing with a non-Jew, all these discussions, I don't think they're that relevant. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's other sources that say it. Yes, and thank you for that about the animal. Was that? I don't know if the Yael means that in Tanakh though with her, if that's why she's called that. Naphtali says that Halav Pesach, which has become mainstream, we tend to forget when it began to pick up steam, daylight savings time. Okay, so today, when the daylight savings time hasn't happened yet, so everything we would delay it, and it adds time onto the Seder. I mean, it makes it we begin the Seder later. So that's you're right, and that I guess that could be an issue, especially since so much of the Seder. Of all these things in the Seder, we think it's so important, and then you learn about it, and they say the reason is for the children. So if by the time you get home, the children are sleeping, it's not such a problem in America now. It's late if the really young ones are, but you could have other places, at least not the New York area, where it's really late, and it could be an hour later. That's a problem. There are some solutions. I was told that you could even before Tseis, I'm told at least, you can ask your rabbi, you could at least start the beginning of the Seder before Kiddush and at least start some things. Hadassah says the name Elimelech is listed in the Sefer Beit Shmuel, which is published in 1691. I think that's the source that's mentioned in the Otzar Rabbanim, where I found where he got his source from. His source from, if I have it here, it comes from, I'm not going to bother, Shlomo Buber. Shlomo Buber has a book about Levov, and he mentions two Elimelechs there. Well, yes, so when I said that there's no Elimelech, I didn't mean no, I meant from Tanakh's time, from the biblical period until that's the legend, that from the biblical period until you get to Elimelech of Lashans. But we have a few Elimelechs, but then it really starts picking up steam when Elimelech has it. Mel says Howell takes 10 minutes. Yeah, it's not a significant delay. And there are things you can do. I would say you can't make Kiddush until after Tseis, but you can, if you want to save some time, there's some other little things perhaps you can do to save a few minutes. It's not that much longer. No, listen, the coffin hasn't been dragged. And again, I'm going to check if it's the coffin of the body, because now I start thinking, because it would make sense for it to be the body. That would really be problematic. And that's what Chizkiyahu did. But this hasn't been done since the mid-19th century. Yisrael Moshe Chazan was the rabbi in Rome in the mid-19th century, and he stopped it then. And Rabbi Shudnow, a big Talmud Mufak of Chacham Fa'or, has that book. Ruth says taking off shoes is a zecher to the Kohanim in the Mikdash. I think that's how you could explain it from the Jewish perspective, but I really think that the reason this takes place in the Muslim world is because the Muslims take off their shoes, and the Jews started doing it because they thought that that's respect. If you're in the Muslim world, they didn't think it was respect. Remember, what are you doing? You're bringing in your dirty shoes. You bring into the shul should be a place of respect, so take the shoes off. Like sometimes you go to people's houses, they tell you to take the shoes off. I think, although they like to say it's a zecher, but I don't think that's the reason. And Michael says, God tells Moshe to take off his shoes at the burning bush since it's holy ground. Yes, that's true. So that could also be a reason given, but we don't have any, that you don't have in our early sources telling us that our shuls are like that, God doesn't literally appear to us there. It hasn't been a practice. It's only a practice in the Muslim world. That's why I'm thinking it probably comes in from the Muslims. And Ruth says it goes back to Moshe. I understand. But the thing is that it's only in the Muslim world. We don't have Ashkenazim doing that. And on the contrary, if you take your shoes off, you try walking into your shul this Shabbos without shoes on and try telling him, well, it's a Migdash Ma'at. They're going to say you're a Mechutzaf. Go put your shoes on. Here's something you'll find interesting. Do you know that the Syrians who do Birkas Kohanim every day, they do not take their shoes off for Birkas Kohanim? Go into Brooklyn, go to Mexico City, go to any of these places. They do not. And the reason I'm told is because when they first came to America, they weren't, they wouldn't have socks, or the socks would have holes in them. So it was embarrassing. Now these guys are so wealthy, they have plenty of socks. But I kid you not, you go to any Syrian shul today and they do not take off their shoes. And some I saw, and I'm told, but I saw some of the younger, more frum ones who go to yeshivas, they take off their shoes, but they're the overwhelming minority. They do not take off their shoes. Ellen makes a good point. Since we have a weekend, there's no longer a need to have the Sabbath on Sunday. That's true. That's a good point. They used to have to keep their stores open on Shabbos. So when are you going to have your day in the temple? You have to have it on Sunday. Rabbi Shubnow says that the Sinai congregation had services on Sunday, and you had to remove your head covering when entering it. But I don't think they still do. Do they still do? Let us know.
No, they don't anymore.
They don't.
I mean, they do Friday nights and Saturday morning Torah study.
Susanna says that her grandmother objected to Trupp because it was not euphonic. Danny says the Svardi infatuation of the reformers was related to association with the golden age of Spain. Indeed, I assume you said that and Moorish architecture before I made the exact same point. Now, someone privately says to me that calling up by number versus name is part of the Westphalia Takanot. There was a quasi-reformer. Well, maybe we'll deal with him in Westphalia. He made Takanot, but this, I believe, not that the person who said this is independent and precedes the Westphalia Takanot. We're talking the early 19th century here. Westphalia Takanot are, I think, 10 years later, but you could check on that. Quickly. Alan. Now you're saying the Rashi school because the only big rabbi the founders could name. Come on. They could come up with some others. They call it the Geiger school. Why not call it the Geiger school or Holtheim or something like that? And Rabbi Shimon says the first Reformed temple in America was in Charleston. And the Chabad synagogue, would people like it as much without food and alcohol? Alcohol isn't significant, I think, for the college minyamin is, but I go to Chabad when I go on vacation in Florida. The food's important, definitely the food. You need the food after davening, but they're not such big on the alcohol. And Danny says he doubts Chabad would have worked in 19th century Hamburg. Okay, correct. We're going to get to Hamburg soon enough. So someone says it's not the Jewish way, a direction of Torah reading. Yes, I understand it's wrong. You should not have Torah reading facing the other direction. The question is if it's already being done and he's having success and he's bringing people in, I didn't feel that it was my place to tell him others. And the question about the question I'm going to ask the Budapest rabbi, I will indeed ask him that question. It's one of mine. Okay, quickly I go through it. My email is shapiro m2@scranton.edu. Shapiro m2@Scranton. I'll write it down for those all these people asking me because you want, I guess you want the Manel Igros. Could you have a Noachide of Erel Ishma? You could, 100% you could. Okay. that's it, I think. Yeah, again, it shows you how when you're talking and you're not thinking. Of course, I know how you spell Yael. My daughter's name is Yael, but it's as you're speaking, you go with the flow when people send these things to you. Remember my other daughter's name? Some of you probably remembered. I told you Daniela, that it's not, remember the Yud, Daniela, not Daniel. People, the name, remember this, the Hebrew name is not Daniel. It's Daniel. The Aleph is silent. The Yud is where the vowel is on. So it's the same thing. It's not Daniela, it's Daniela. With that, Rabbi Kelman, take it away.
Thank you. I am curious. I don't understand why. I understand we don't do it. Well, what's the halachic problem for turning around during laning? It's only dafka for Amida.
No, the problem is because the non-religious, the non-Orthodox, I don't want to say non-religious because some of them are religious or not. Just like this is pointing out Rav Hoffman, we have chukas agayim, but there's also something called chukas apikorsim. If the non-observant institutes,
but you can say that about everything. I mean, that's what people say.
Next class, we're going to get into the tshuva about organ, and we're going to see how the Rav, the traditional Rav, justifies having an organ, even though the non-Orthodox, because they have candles in the churches, we have candles. They have, but this is clearly. Yeah.
I just don't get why. I don't know why the laity would be.
But the priest faces the laity. There's all sorts of problems.
That's the rabbi. In Moshe, the rabbi faces the laity too. He sits up front facing the laity.
Yeah, but he's not when he's the chazan. Not when he's the chazan. When he's the chazan, we don't face. If the chazan,
no, I understand, but we know
in the non-Orthodox shows the chazan, they turned it around so the chazan. By the shul I'm talking about, the chazan didn't face it. It was only Kriyas Torah that faced it.
Right,
but
that's what I'm saying. It shouldn't be a problem.
Synagogues, the chazan often faces the community. Technically, what's the difference? But that's the reformers started that. So therefore, you can't do something that the reformers did.
Yeah, okay, but fine. But that's halakhically, there should be no problem to face for Kriyas Torah.
A lot of things is no problem.
Yeah, we know that, but I'm saying this
something is not. A lot of things are not halachic. But they could be very important. Imitating the reformers, that's
but it's interesting why certain things became imitating reformers and certain things be copied. We give sermons in English, that's reform.
That's a good point.
So many things. Well, two of the biggest Orthodox shuls are drawn to a round. You're not allowed to have a round shul. Clerical.
Why don't we say, you know what? Maybe in a few classes or 5 classes, when we finish this, maybe we can come up because. You guys can help me come up with some principles. Did it just come out random, or are there actually some principles behind when we decided we could follow them and when we couldn't? It
could be where and who and flukes and what time
so
period and who was the leading rabbi when this one came in. Like why is davening in English became such a terrible thing, which is totally mutter, and speaking in English became okay. Like
we're giving a sermon in English,
right? That's what I'm saying. Giving a sermon in English, okay. Daven in English, the Mishnah is 1,000% clear. You've mentioned, we've all know that. The Mishnah is 1,000% clear. You can daven in whatever language you want. And yet that became, my God, in an Orthodox shul, you say a reading in English, they'll stone you. But so why that one became verboten and the sermons, okay, it's very hard to figure that out.
Right. And by the way, Danny, understand that he points out that the priests did not face the crowd. Yeah, I think that was actually Vatican II. They started facing it, but I don't know the history of all that, but I think the non-Catholics might have faced it. I'm not sure about that. But okay, Rabbi.
Lots of interesting stuff. Yes, I know. And that's an excuse people use why they talk in Orthodox shuls, because they're quite in Reform shuls. So I've heard many people say that, and they unfortunately say it with a straight face. That's the problem, because they really mean it. We're at home. No, we're at home in a shul. The Reform is just a guest, so he doesn't talk. Where feel at home. It's believe me, the Mishnah Berurah, no halachic authority held from that ridiculous excuse. Okay, Marc, we look forward to seeing you. Yes, Rabbi Oberlander, I had been answering Madrid, but we switched it this Wednesday, 2:30 p.m. actually. And Rabbi Oberlander gives a shiur every week until 2. So we're doing our Wednesday visiting communities around the world. Budapest, new week, hope we should hear good things. Budapest borders on Ukraine at part of the country. So it's let's hope we hear, not just for that reason, but we should hear Besurot Tovot. But that will be Wednesday at 2:30 p.m., Dr. Marc will be talking to Rabbi Oberlander from Budapest. And of course, tomorrow, Dr. Kohler continues his series on Megillat Esther at 9:30 in the morning, followed by Rachel Sharansky-Danziger at 11, followed by Alex Israel at 1. And then Wednesday shears followed at 8 p.m. by Dr. Sokolow putting together the Torah, Shuli Mishkin, 12 noon on biblical archaeology. And then Rabbi Gemara giving the Parsha Shir to 8:30 at night, and then my shir on the Siddur at 9 a.m. So we look forward to learning with you and your friends. Is Jew and Gentile over? Yes. The Wednesday series by Menachem Kellner is over. Yes. And okay. So okay. I hope everybody be well. And bring your friends and invite them, and Laila Tov, and we hope to hear good news and good things from around the world. Okay, Laila Tov.